Hi, hello everyone who is joining us. Please use the chat to introduce yourself. We will be starting in a couple of minutes. Please let us know where you're from in the world. So we already said we have Dublin. Where in the world are you joining us from? Bangladesh. Hi. So we have US, UK. Nice to see you. Netherlands, Europe, Pakistan. Hello. So how is the weather there? So in Central Europe, we have a couple of quite strong heat waves. So temperatures probably like for Michael in Israel and in Greece. But I know that also in New York they had some strong heat waves. So how is it for you right now? Rainy. Great. Good to see you. So, what department are you joining from? Are you all in quality assurance or engineering, manufacturing? What part of pharma are you? Rafael has 22 degrees. Oh, that's just perfect. Yeah, QA manufacturing. Nice. API sales. That's interesting, Barbara. Interesting. Good. Thank you for joining us. So I will wait another minute for people to continue join us. And we'll start with the introduction of this very fascinating topic. Please confirm in the chat if you can hear me clearly. I have my air conditioning on, so hopefully it doesn't interfere. And you should see also the slide saying welcome starting soon. So just confirm that you can hear me well and you can see the slide, and then we will jump right into the session. Perfect. See a thumbs up from Dorothy. Very clear. Perfect. Happy to hear that. Nice. So let's then jump into it. Right. So officially, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Qualistory and with cooperation with UPRI. My name is Jan, the director at Qualistory, and I will be your main moderator for this session. And we have a very fascinating topic today, understanding the 21 CFR Part 11 guidelines for temperature records. And in this webinar, you will gain a lot of knowledge and practical examples that you need to navigate the complexities of the FDA 21 CFR Part 11 guidelines from very knowledgeable experts. Please note that this webinar will be around 75 minutes, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please use the chat box freely to chat with your colleague, chat with us, and ask your questions. We will either address them immediately. We have a great UPRI team that sits also in the back office and ready to answer your questions or temperature monitoring live. And we will also take questions at the end. So use the chat and make it lively. If you stay until the end of the session, please do. You will receive a free certificate of attendance that is sponsored by our event partner, UPRI. So we do request that you stay at least until the end of the lecture, and it's okay if you need to run off after after the lecture during the Q&A. But we usually put the line on around 50 minutes for you to stay in the session. So please do, and you will get the certificate within 7 working days. And if you don't get it, please shoot us an email. And now I'm eager to introduce to you the speakers at today's webinar, which is Adam Hartman Krakow and Jakub Konradsen. And Adam is the co-founder at UPRI together with Jakub, and Jakub is right now also the head of quality there. So Adam has a background in design and innovation engineering, and he co-founded UPRI in 2013, and their goal is to automate temperature compliant solution. And right now he is heading UPRI's global growth strategies, and joining him is Jakub, who has a background in electrical engineering, a broad experience within the thermal validation and calibration field, and he's very passionate about providing companies with cost-effective solutions that balance regulatory requirements and risk-based approach. So I am confident you can learn a lot from those two guys today. So happy learning, and I will now give the stage to our speakers.
Hi, everybody. So thank you very much, Jan, for the presentation. We are super happy to have you here as part of our webinar. It's a topic that Jakub and I and the rest of the team is continuously working with our own products. And it's something that came onto our minds quite many years ago, when audits and compliance and everything like that, because we were working with life science and pharma customers, this was just a thing that we couldn't come about unless we really looked into it.
Absolutely.
So again, I have Jakub here with me, head of quality and my co-founder. I got to know Jakub back in the days when we studied at the Technical University of Denmark, and Jakub was studying space engineering. So why did you end up over here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. yeah. But I love working within the quality field, and I think 21 CFR Part 11 is really also one of the topics that are, to me, a very interesting topic, because the requirements and regulations are pretty basic or pretty simplified, at least, and when you compare them to some of the other regulations. But we see over and over again customers having questions regarding how should they deal with these 21 CFR Part 11 requirements and how should they implement them into processes. So I'm really excited about getting to talk today, and I'm really excited about getting questions from you guys, because I'm not sure we've heard all the questions yet, but I'm sure we'll hear some of the same questions over. So that'll be very nice. Yeah.
Nice, Harold. And then maybe just a I don't know, short intro to why we talk about this. So UPRI is, we call it a one-stop solution for temperature compliance. And the reason is that we offer our customers kind of a full package of temperature compliance, calibration, validation, monitoring. This is all you need in order for you to kind of be compliant towards the regulations in place here. And we realized, again, that this audit was something that would come back to us and our customers all the time, that our support would often get a chance to support during an audit, actually. So that's almost why we do it. We help our customers get ready for an audit very easily, very fast. And that's the features we build into our solutions that we offer. And that's what we've been working with for years now. So we have multiple different pieces of software, hardware to measure temperatures, humidity, etc., and also a patent on a calibration process that are quite different and that you might stumble upon during this presentation also.
Absolutely.
Right. This slide we already have. So the agenda today, we're going to talk about CFR Part 11?
Absolutely. So today we're going to talk about, first of all, what is 21 CFR Part 11? And I think it's also important to mention that we've given it a sort of the subtitle of temperature records. So of course, 21 CFR Part 11 is, as we'll get into, is mandated also for all predicate rules. So it accounts for a lot of different records when working in the GXP industry, but we've chosen today to focus and narrow it down to temperature records. So we'll also talk about which kind of records would fall under 21 CFR Part 11. And I also must mention, I think initially, that we'll try to do the short version. For the rest of it, just call it Part 11, because otherwise we'll use all our time to say 21 CFR. We'll talk shortly about what the requirements are, and then we'll leave time for Q&A. And also, we've introduced an example of what it means. That's one of the often asked questions. So I have these regulations, but what does it mean in my daily life? And we'll try to walk through an example, a day in the life of doing something related to temperature records. And as we've talked about as well, you're very welcome to come with any questions during this. We have our back office team here of Anya and Frederikke trying to answer all of your questions, and they'll bring questions forward to us as well. So please don't hesitate to interrupt and ask questions along the way. It always goes for a very nice talk and discussion along the way.
Absolutely.
So should we get started?
Absolutely.
So first of all, what is 21 CFR Part 11? And I think the best explanation to that is kind of spell out the letters. So it's the 21st chapter of the Code of Federal Regulation. So we're already there. We know it has something to do with the FDA and the US. One of the first questions I often get is, well, I'm a European-based country, so why does it matter for me? And as we'll get more into detail later on, it's either required if you're dealing or selling in the US, of course, but also due to recent harmonization, 21 CFR sort of become the golden standard for everything to do with digital records and digital signatures and systems and processes for handling that. And Part 11 is just because it's the 11th part, so it's quite straightforward. One thing I also often get asked is, where do I find it? It's very simple. You can find it on the FDA homepage on the CGMP. So it's quite easy to find the regulations and read through them. They're not that many pages. And there are also a ton of great guides. And we also have some guides on our webpage as well in how to interpret those different rules. So, but getting into the meat of it, 21 CFR Part 11 is, in my mind at least, the basic idea of being able to trust digital records. So it was regulations that were established by the US Food and Drug Administration to ensure that we have integrity, authenticity, and reliability of electronic records and signatures in regulated industries such as the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. So the very short history of it is that back in the 70s and 80s, industry came forward and asked the FDA to take a stand on the digitalization of the industry back then. I wasn't born back then, but I can read my history. And FDA started to recognize that companies would start to go away from paper records until digital systems. So how and going from a golden standard of handwritten signatures, and paper-based records, they needed to take a stand. And in '97, they published the first version of 21 CFR Part 11. So in other words, why is it needed? Well, it's basically, how do you go from paper records to digital records? In my mind, that's when you read through the requirements, keep that at the back of your mind. We're going from paper to digital, and we needed to trust records in the same way that we could do with paper records. And why? I think I often like to point out that I think if we wrote new regulations today, we would probably not be taking a starting point from paper records and then saying, how do we transform that to digital records? We will probably go digital first, but I think it's always important to remember sort of the historical background. Why was this initiated, and why was it processed in the beginning? So often when I try to explain this, just remember it's just like paper records, but in digital format. And one of the other questions we often get is, what if I'm only in the European region, what do we do? And I think the European counterpart is Annex 11, what has to do with validation of computerized systems, in which it's also described how to deal with digital signatures in much less detail, though. But I think in broader terms, the 21 CFR Part 11 is sort of the go-to standard. And I don't think I've heard of anyone missing an audit or gotten a non-compliance from EMA, for example, for following 21 CFR Part 11.
Because the UTRA-LEX also have a...
Yeah, it also has some parts regarding digital signatures and digital records, but it's much less detailed described. But for general purpose, the 21 CFR Part 11 is just a really, really good requirement. It's a really good point to start from, at least, and very detailed and practical.
Because like you mentioned, that typically a pharma company, they will have serving a global market, and as long as they serve...
Yeah, I think
in the States,
from our customer standpoint, in most cases, that's the case, that you're dealing with the US anyway, so you need to adhere to those regulations, but due to harmonization of requirements and standards, it's sort of become the golden standard for that. That's what we see in most cases, at least.
And in case of a company from the States trying to live up to the European version in the UTRA-LEX, and they're already done or ish. By living up to FDA Part 11.
Yeah, as I think it's common knowledge that as long as you get past the FDA, you'll get past the rest of the regulatory bodies. They're the harshest, and the general guidelines also, as we'll dig much more into later on, is also that validation and traceability are part of 21 CFR Part 11, but as are all other standards as well, needing to adhere to traceability and validity of your records. But I think for the sake of time, we should get moving as well. If I can. Yes, so one thing I would like to point out is often when we get customers asking us regarding 21 CFR Part 11, they'll often think about the technical implementation, so the system. And a very typical question that I get is this system 21 CFR Part 11 compliant? And from my perspective, that's actually not possible, because there are no systems in the world that need to adhere to Part 11. Companies have to adhere to Part 11. They need to adhere by the regulation, and they need to have a process that is compliant, and a company that needs to be compliant to regulation. So also with the small illustration we've tried to explain to the right here, is that you can have systems which enable you to operate compliant to the 21 CFR Part 11. And I'd always try to convince people to think in terms of processes rather than in systems. And the common example, as I also think we'll explain this later on, is that when you buy a car, it needs to have all the safety features. It needs to have lights. It needs to have seat belts. It needs to have airbags. But no matter how well designed and how well built a car is, it's never safe unless you drive by the driving laws, right? You must remember to look left and right. A car cannot do that for you. But of course, you need a system that will enable you to do compliant processes. And often systems will have some validated functionalities that will allow you to be in compliance with Part 11, but they will never do it on their own. So think people before systems, and think company processes before people as well. So
and then what you say is that in the end, then what the system can do is then help you speed up the process.
Yeah, either systems can help you speed up the process, and also there are some functionalities which we'll get into detail later on, which are just required from a system for you in order to operate it or perform your processes in compliance. And one thing as well that we often see, I think specifically as well in the GDP sections, which are only dealing normally with transportations and logistics surrounding pharmaceuticals, is that 21 CFR Part 11 becomes the only standard to adhere to. But I think it's always important to remember that all the other regulations still applies. So validation of systems, training of personnel, all those things are still part of a compliant process or compliant company. Sometimes 21 CFR Part 11 becomes sort of the only standard to follow, and I think that's a wrong assumption. At least it holds a lot of the regulations, and also it shares a lot of its requirements with other standards. specifically also with Annex 11 as well. But I think we'll get into detail with those things later on. So the second question, the second topic we have here is which records fall under Part 11, or which record do we need to keep in a Part 11 compliant manner? And there's a very easy question to that, or there's a very simple answer to that question. First of all, it's a very, if you have any sort of records that you use in a GXP environment, an educated guess is yes, you need to comply with the 21 CFR Part 11. On a very, very high level, now remember today we're talking about temperature records specifically and digital signatures in that connection. On a very high level, if you have a document that you use in any way to make a GXP decision, then it is subject to 21 CFR Part 11. So is there any document that you would rely on in order to make any decisions related to a GXP process, then it applies. First of all, when we look at sort of what are records and how should these be, how does these terminology be applied? The 21 CFR Part 11 defines it as electronic records, signatures, and handwritten signatures executed to electronic records. So when thinking about which records and what does record mean, it's both the data and the signature that accompanies it. And as well, I think from a very high level perspective as well, remember that the records that are required to be maintained under control under 21 CFR Part 11 are predicate rules. So predicate rules, of course, being any sort of documentation that is directly mandated by the FDA codes. So that could also be records that are in electronic format in addition to paper format. That's sometimes a question that we get is like, okay, well, I print out all my documentation and I keep it in paper format. In that case, those direct paper documentation is not needed. But if you do any sort of digital signature to them or have any digital actions, so you create digital records, it's required. As well, any records that are submitted and actually also not submitted but required to be maintained under predicate rules or maintained to under predicate rules but are not submitted to the FDA are also required. And as well, I think one of the definitions also that electronic signatures that are intended to be used instead of handwritten signatures is also another way to look at it. So if you do a digital signature in a digital system that you would otherwise do in person, then it's most likely going to be maintained under 21 CFR Part 11 requirements. It all gets a bit technical, so that's always why I always go back to, if that kind of stumbles your mind, then going back to, do I use this piece of documentation to make a GXP decision? Then yes, you would need to maintain it under 21 CFR Part 11. I hope that makes sense. It's always a big, there's always a lot of misconceptions regarding this. But again, going back to an educated guess would be yes, you would need to maintain it under 21 CFR Part 11.
I definitely think we can easily dive into examples in the QA.
And then we have some examples as well later on in terms of what would that mean specifically for temperature records. So we're hopefully
because there could be plenty here. Like there's so many tons of different ways of looking at this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we have some good examples later on what that specifically means for temperature records. So yeah, that's actually right now, yeah. So again, how does that relate to temperature data? Again, predicate rule, if it's directly stated that you need to maintain some sort of documentation required by the FDA guidelines, then yes, you need to adhere to the 21 CFR Part 11. Again, relied on to perform regulated activities. So in terms of temperature data, that would be records of temperature of temperatures monitored, for example. It could be records with digital signatures of reviewing processes. So you often have to do tendency analysis as an example of the temperatures within a warehouse or fridge or freezer. That review would have to be recorded according to 21 CFR Part 11. of course, all documentation submitted to the FDA. And remember that it's equivalent of handwritten signatures. So any signatures that you perform in a digital in a digital system would be required to be held under 21 CFR Part 11.
And you mentioned signatures as a way, but I assume it's also, I don't know, changes and protocol changes in general and stuff like that, because that's part of a thing that would need a signature in order for you to authorize it, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a major. I think I always revert back to saying, if you did this in paper, would you then sign it? So as an example, from a temperature monitoring standpoint, let's say you did a change to an alarm setting somewhere. Would you have an equivalent table or piece of paper where you log down your changes and sign them? Yes, you would have. Okay. So therefore, that's a digital record as well. And those things should show up in an audit trail as well, as we'll go into later on. But in general, any system that you would sign up for, you would need to adhere by. So another misconception I often hear is, what if I just go in and view some data? Do I need to use my digital signature? Well, have you performed any type of action in that regard? No. If you wanted to document that you reviewed it with your signature, then yes, you would have to be a part of Part 11.
Right. Yeah. So if you have a let's say a USB data logger, and you once a week you need to empty it to a computer, and you need to log it. It is an action, right? And then you would need to document your signature somewhere.
Yeah, exactly.
In a compliant manner.
So that's a very good example. Extraction of data from a data log as an example. If all you're doing is extracting data and never using that data, then no, it does not have to adhere to Part 11. But if you use that data to make a GXP decision based on it, and most likely you are, otherwise why would you gather that data? Then yes, you would need to adhere to the Part 11.
Because this is data that you would essentially use during an audit to show.
Yeah, during an audit, or it could be required, but it is a predicate rule to maintain environmental records. So under that assumption, yes, you would need to adhere to Part 11.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah. So what are the requirements? So first of all, 21 CFR Part 11 is divided into 3 subparts. There's the general provisions, where we have the definitions of the different terminology. We won't go too much into detail today about the specific terminology of some of it, of course, unless there are some specific questions. The second parts are electronic records, and the third part being electronic signatures. So Part 11 distinguishes between electronic records and electronic signatures. And the reasoning behind that is to differentiate between when a person has made any sort of signature following an action in a system, and when we're just talking about electronic records. I think that eases the sort of understanding and the differentiation between electronic records and signatures, as we'll also go through. But again, I would always suggest going in and reading the regulations, because they're actually quite detailed, and they also have some very specific requirements for how to maintain and how to validate that, or the requirements for how you should perform the validation and how it should be implemented. Absolutely. So we've gathered 8 topics that we believe is sort of the smooth way through going through the requirements. Rather than going through all the requirements, I think we would need a bit longer time. We've kind of tried to distill down what are sort of the 8 topics you should comply with or should be concerned about when dealing with 21 CFR Part 11.
And we also boiled this down into a document that we'll just send to you after when we enter the Q&A session.
Absolutely. I think, but before we continue, I think it could be very nice finding out how well-wondered you are on this. So there'll be a question popping up on your screen just shortly. It'll be very interesting to see your answers.
It should be there, I think. Yeah, it's open for voting. Can you see it out there? It should be close to the chat. Display on the video. Like, oh, there. So now at least you can see if you answer it. You see it? Okay, that's great. Can you answer it also? No, maybe just.
So basically, we're trying to get you to answer the question of how confident you are with the 21 CFR Part 11 requirements, and should hopefully come up in just a second.
Now
yeah, we get it.
Perfect. All right, cool. But maybe we can just let it stay there for a short time, and then we can open it up again to see.
Absolutely.
Because there's a slight delay on the voting system, I see. So let's just give it 2 minutes.
Yeah, so in general, the 8 topics we'll go through is how to ensure data integrity. That's a very large part of it. And you might say, well, of course we need to ensure data integrity. That's kind of one of the core pillars of computer system validation, for example, which is also required. And this is one of the few areas, or some of the few topics, at least in Part 11, that I think floats over to the other requirements, or kind of fills in or spills into some of the other requirements and regulations. You need to make sure that you use user access control and authentication. We'll talk about what does that mean. We'll talk about the audit trail. That's something that seems to be confusing for some people, at least. What is an audit trail and how should you use it as well? How to document your monitoring process, because today we're talking specifically about temperature monitoring, change control processes, how be specified about how to do reviews. That's actually something that's not easily viewable in the regulations, but that we often see enforced by auditors, and how to review your monitoring system. And as well, we'll talk a little bit about training and sort of what the requirements are there. So do we have some results?
Yeah,
I'm quite interested in seeing. So going from I have no idea to very confident, it seems like a normal distribution. That makes me, as someone working in calibration, very happy as well, that we see most people know the general principles, but I'm also very happy to see that some people are very confident and some have little understanding. Hopefully that should change. There could be fun making the same survey just after this presentation. But I think we'll just move on here.
Yeah, and also share the ones that are very confident, or the ones that have no idea what could we change. That could be cool. So just share your ideas in the chat. Thanks.
There
you go.
Yes. So first of all, ensuring data integrity. So again, for someone working in the GXP industry, this would sort of be a of course moment. But what's really important in terms of specifically as well temperature records is that you protect against data loss and tampering. So we often talk about the incentive to cheat or alter records, and that can sometimes, because it can have very high financial costs. Some of the things we see often being focused on is tampering with data, so that you would get fine results when you didn't have good results. So that should be one of your areas of focus at least. And then of course, unauthorized access to systems can not so often from a perspective of someone viewing your data, more in the perspective of someone being able to alter settings and so forth. The other things that are required by Part 11 is what we call device checks. So what are device checks? It's basically that we can ensure the validity of data sources. So what does that mean? So if we have a digital record, an example of a digital record in a temperature monitoring setting would be a data logger, for example. So how do you ensure that the validity of that data source is in place? How do you know, if you don't have an automated system, how do you know that the measurements from a specific data logger actually originates from that specific data logger? How do you couple that with the position or the fridge or whatever it's from? And that is again a point in which a system can only do so much in terms of cryptography, encryption, and automated systems. But if you don't have a good process of ensuring that you know where that data log was placed, then the validity of those measurements are actually not valid anymore, because they might not originate from the unit that you're trying to measure. So again, a system can only do so much. Also, in terms of data integrity, we need to make sure that records are linked to person, time, and meaning. And it's mentioned several places in Part 11 requirements. So it basically means that if we have a digital record where it says that you, Adam, did something, we need to ensure that that record is linked to a specific person, that it's linked to a specific time, and it's linked to a specific meaning. So what was it that you were trying to achieve? So again, think back to paper records. Whenever you're signing off of something, you're probably signing off that you did some action. And that action needs to be in there. So examples that I've seen of systems that were not really compliant is where there was some record, some data, and then there was a signature. But it does not say what that signature meant. It was basically putting your name on a piece of paper. It was not, I did review this or similar. Yeah. Moving ahead here, so user access and control. So a system, it's also mentioned in Part 11, I think also as per many systems, is that you need to have appropriate access levels. You also need to have unique users. And why would you need unique users? Well, because just as if you're doing a handwritten signature, that's unique to you, the same has to apply in a digital system. And often we see that your email is being used as sort of the uniqueness. Another thing that needs to be in place is that you need to be aware, or people using a digital system need to be aware that the legality of the digital signature is just the same as you did a handwritten signature. There's often sort of the human perception that if you do a handwritten signature, you're aware that you're doing something which has legal meaning, but the same must apply in a digital system. So you need to inform your organization's personnel that if you do a digital signature, it's just the same as if you do a handwritten one. And you also need some way to authenticate users. And what does that mean? If I can just get the, sorry, here. What does that mean? It means that signatures, of course, in order for them to be trustworthy and reliable and equivalent to handwritten signatures, Part 11 fortunately gives us very good advice on how to do that. And it actually allows for you to use biometric signatures, fingerprint, iris scan, face recognition. It also requires you to use digital signals that use cryptographic techniques to ensure the validity of it. And also it allows for you to use your username and password as well as a PIN code. It has, I won't go into detail because it actually has very specifics on how to use those, but it basically means as well that every time you're signing off for something, you need to reuse your password. And you can actually also use handwriting capture in software, although I often see it not used because it takes up quite a lot of time to do that every single time. Yeah, and then we come to the audit trail. So what is an audit trail? An audit trail is a collection of all the different signatures that were made in a system connected to the actions that were made. So first of all, it's made so that we have traceability in the system. So all audit trail entries must have what was the action, who was the user, and at what time was it performed. And that's very important because it allows you to go back and see which actions were performed by which persons at what time. So whenever in a temperature monitoring setting, it would often be something like who changed the alarm settings, who stopped an alarm, who signed off on an alarm, for example, and all that should be viewable in the audit trail. So consider the audit trail as a very big list of all the actions that you would otherwise need to gather from a lot of different pieces of paper and put together the puzzle in one big audit trail.
We got a question from from an attendee that you have this audit trail, you have it all logged historically. Do you need to periodically create a report from this audit trail, or is that just part of your process definition?
That's a really good question, actually. So the Part 11 does not specifically require you to do a review of the audit trail. As I remember, it has some terminology regarding making sure that logs are verified to some sort of, I must be sure there. Okay. But basically as well, I often think that on a risk-based approach, going through the audit trail when reviewing your system anyway, you would actually allow you to make sure that no one did an unauthorized or accidental change to an alarm setting, as an example. One of the things we often see that go wrong during audits are that you have a list of storage units, for example, that should have specific alarm settings. And then during an audit, of course, always doing a custom audit or a regulatory audit always happens there. You see that the alarm settings are different or they've been changed. And who did that at what point in time? That could have been avoided by going through the audit trail. And most audit trails can also be filtered by type. So my suggestion will always be to filter by which are the critical changes to a system, and then filter by those and go see through what were the changes made and by which people, and does it make sense. I've yet to see someone needed to do a report based on the audit trail though, but it's a good question. If I can get control back here.
So there you go.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the fourth part is you need to document your monitoring procedures. And of course, you need to create clear SOPs. I think there's also been some very good presentations in Quilistory about how to do very good, clear SOPs. But it actually does require you, Part 11, that you know how to operate the system and that you've trained your users in how you should use the system in a compliant way. So again, back to one of the first slides, you can never have a system that is fully 21 CFR Part 11 compliant by itself. You need to operate it compliantly. And often auditors will require you to have SOPs that instruct its users exactly on how to do it. How do you use the system and who does what? Part 11 also has some very tight specifications that you need to have an authorized way of performing certain actions. So if you have a flow of actions that needs to be performed in a certain way, either the system should only allow you to perform those actions in that order, or you should have SOPs in place that describe how to do those in order. An example could be deviation management. So handling temperature alarms, for example, you would often have a first response. So someone signing off, they've seen the alarm. You would have a correction immediately, closing the door, turning on the backup generators, whatever it might be. And then you'd have your normal Kappa handling. And you need to have controlled flow of how to do those actions. So that's also one of the topics, at least, that we advise, that you document how you do monitoring procedures. And I need to get, yeah.
And when do you do that? Like, is that part of the qualification in the beginning, or?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So of course, if you want to be compliant from day one, the SOPs need to be in place day one. Although I'd often see a first stage SOP, and then when working with the system, it sort of gives you second stage improved versions of it. I think we could talk about hours on how to write good SOPs, but I'll avoid the topic for now. Another requirement from Part 11 is that you implement change control. As with all other systems in a GXP environment, you need to implement change control. But you need to manage whenever there's an update to a system or an update to how you use the system in a compliant way, you need to make sure that you have change control in place. So as I talked about before, if you have controlled workflows on how to operate the system, you need to have those processes under change control. And the same thing goes for the change of users, the change of monitoring devices, as an example.
Suppliers, calibration,
all those different things. And as well as we've included here that your procedure should include how you identify devices, systems, how you document them, how you evaluate them, approval, testing, implementation. I think this goes in a very broad GXP setting as well. But generally, people tend to forget the change control processes regarding digital signatures, and that's something that's quite important as well. I'll move on here. So if I can, oh yes, sorry. So review as well. There are several reviews that we often see people lagging in. First of all, the monitoring procedures. What do you do if something happens? So what are your procedures regarding? I think this is a very general term that it's good to do a review of. But in general, it's very important to identify if there's any problem areas within the system, whether there are any procedures that don't really comply with the roles and the users in the system anymore. We often see, not often, but we sometimes see customers where certain control flows can't be performed because there's been a change in users. So those need to be evaluated. Also the monitoring system, of course, as with all our system, a review is good, but making sure that all the components are still in compliance, that we have device checks in place and so forth. And I think the most important one is users in the system, because you need to be aware of who your users are, and that you have your users under control, and that you remove user access if it's not required anymore. Because again, a user in the system can perform a legally binding signature. So if you have former employees or whatever in the system, it could be cause for non-conformities.
Is it also, temperature monitoring is among, well, for most of you out there, it might be that it's not a full-time job. It's a part of
Yeah.
So we will come back to the training, but to catch a misuse or a mishabit, because something is written in the SOPs and this is how you do it, but there's still a lot of feeling to many of the things. Like you just have to do this, and and then you can make it work. This is how the old guy did it.
Yeah.
This is also part of catching in reviews, isn't it?
Yeah, and absolutely. I think also in terms of Part 11, it's very specific on the requirements of an example could be shared users. So again, think about when you're doing a digital signature, it's the same as doing it by hand. So if you have a user if you're logged in as a different user, for example, you could sign on behalf of someone else. So through a review process, you should also really consider your processes. Do you log on from a central computer? Do you log on from your personal computer? Where do you leave those? There are several different aspects, and I think there's often a light going on when something people get a sort of a bright epiphany. That was the word. Thank you. When you tell them that you could easily do a legally binding signature in a 21 CFR Part 11 compliance system if you have the user, people start to think much more about how to protect their passwords and how to protect their login credentials. That's a very important thing to remember, I think. So we'll just move on here. So first of all, when reviewing your monitoring system, I think this also comes from a standpoint that we see a lot of customers who are not yet 21 CFR Part 11 compliant and wish to be. As I mentioned the example before, no matter how safe your car is, you still have to drive it responsibly, right? And again, there's no system that will ensure complete compliance. One of the requirements, as an example from Part 11, is that you need to be able to authenticate persons using the system. So how do you know that a person is actually that person? Do you need to see a driver's license? Do you need social security or identification or so forth to be able to make sure that that person is actually that person? And through that, you still have to review it, and you still have to do that manually. Some systems can do that, often very complicated systems, but yet again, there are other areas in which you need your process in place rather than relying on the system.
And isn't it also something that if we expect that most of the attendees out there is from a life science or pharma company, they would have some sort of organizational way to manage this kind of authenticity, like the ISO 27001 and 2? That's part of that framework also.
It's a very good question also, but one of the pitfalls I often see is that people have gone to great lengths to document in the general quality management system the identity of their users. But it's important that you can document the link between that person and that user in the system. Often we see people relying on email addresses for unique identification. So how do you make sure that only users that have a valid email, which has already been assigned to that specific person, which you have already validated as being a real person? And that link there is really important to make and being able to document to auditors. Because it's very rare that we see that people are not aware of who they've hired, but making that link to a system that's Part 11 compliant, that can be a pitfall at least. So to the last of our steps here, we've lost number 8. That's okay. So it's just me here. So what should you look for when going through and trying to find a system? I would say the most important parts are, of course, first of all, what we call compliance check marks. Is it validated? Is the system calibrated? That will ensure validity of measurements. And from a usability standpoint, do we have traceability? Do we have different permission types so that you can actually allow for controlled flows? Do we allow for unique users? And do we allow for an audit trail? Those are sort of the 4 big points I would look for when finding a system. And as well, the last point I thought we were missing, but that's just on me, training people. So it's actually a requirement that you can document that people know how to operate the system, both in a compliant way as well as operating in quote unquote normally. And also, it's required that you can document whenever you update procedures, and specifically also procedures that have to do with controlled flows. And as well, it also ensures that you have no misunderstandings. And I would say, as a last part, also remember that you actually have to inform the FDA of your use of electronic signatures and records. With the recent 2021 edition, you don't have to do it by paper anymore. I always found that funny that you had to actually write a letter to the FDA, but luckily they've updated the regulation to also include an email format. And you need to write them and inform them of your intent to use a digital system instead of a paper-based system.
And isn't it probably the place where you might see errors and faults, whenever you don't train these assistants that would do it, during a winter break or summer break or something like that, and then suddenly, a process is followed slightly different than it's supposed to, and then you just have it.
And I would say that the good thing about having a Part 11 compliant system is always that if it's truly compliant, you have an audit trail. So it's always possible to go back and see which person did what. But of course, if you fall into the pitfall of having shared users, an example, it's really not possible to see which users did what changes. So that's often one of the pitfalls as well. Next, we'll just kind of go through what could be Part 11 records for temperature monitoring. Some of the examples, I think we've been through some of them today at least, is alarm handling and consequent deviation management. That would be something that you would write off. It has a meaning. You would write in the meaning and the type of the event. It could be review of environmental tendencies. So there's often a requirement to review tendencies that are critical process parameters. So that could be temperature, relative humidity as well, tons of other parameters, of course, as well. But review of those, if you needed a signature on review of those would have to be Part 11 compliant. Changes to alarm settings. When did you change it, and by which person, and at what point in time? That would also have to be linked to a specific person, which would then show up in an audit trail. You could make up tons more of different types of records, but these are sort of the most common ones in a temperature monitoring setting. So we've actually compiled just a few examples of one of the questions. So what does it mean for me in everyday life? What does it mean when I have to go through my daily job tasks? But before that, we actually have just another question that we'd like to ask you here. So what is your biggest concern in terms of 21 CFR Part 11 compliance? And hopefully you can see it out there. Please, someone write in the chat whether you can see it.
We can see it.
Yeah, so we have a few answers pulling in here.
We'll just come back to that in a moment, I think. Great.
So while we wait for some more answers, we've really basically compiled a sort of a date with FDA 21 CFR Part 11. We thought that the title was nice, at least. So basically, we've tried to say from UPRI system, how would it look and what kind of implications does it have? Because I think we should also be fair that whenever a company decides to adhere to 21 CFR Part 11, it does slow down daily work because you do have to sign off on more stuff. It is much easier, I would say, to use a digital system, of course, because you don't need to bring out the pen and paper to do it. But what would it look like in terms of a system? So just very briefly about UPRI, just to get you sort of into understanding, we use a combination of these internet-connected devices that can measure temperature, humidity, and a lot of other things, together with calibration and our validation and monitoring application. So in that setting, what would 21 CFR Part 11 mean for you? So here's an example of an alarm that has occurred. So we have a user here which notices that there is an alarm. And in order to do deviation management, they will type in a message following the controlled flow. And one thing you'll notice here is that that user has to type in a password again. So that's one of the very specific requirements from 21 CFR Part 11. This also means that we'll be able to download an audit log and see that that person has made that change at that very specific point in time. Another example, if I can get control back here. Another example would be a user here wanting to do a reporting and reviewing of that process, in which case you would look at the data and you would be able to input your registration that you reviewed some data. But this is basically also an example of what we call scoped audit trails. So often when we think about audit trails, we think of a very long list of all actions performed to a certain system by specific users in a time span. But one thing that often gets overlooked are these scoped out or focused audit trails. So this here is an example of a report being taken from the system where we've scoped down and looked at some very specific actions performed by some very specific users. So in this case, we'll be able to see our user here. I can see it's my colleague Adam here who's done some deviation management. You can actually see the person, the time, and the action that was performed. That's one part of an audit trail, as well as being able to see when different temperature loggers were placed at specific positions and correlated with specific calibrations. And this one lastly, oh, sorry, yes. So, yeah, this was the one. I'll just move on here.
Cool.
Yeah, so to kind of try to summarize as well, if you're dealing with monitoring software, general validation approach and accredited calibration is of course part of it. And as well, remember to think about user roles and authentication, as well as audit logs and reports that you're able to take out. So both these general audit logs and reports which are scoped in audit trails and this mandatory signing of records. Yeah, so maybe we'll already now have some. Okay, so that's a fairly rectangular distribution, I think. So we have some general feedback on the regulations are hard to understand. It's hard to understand how to apply the requirements, and find it difficult to find a compliant solution. And I think those are all equally valid, and some even said all of the above. So we might as well just use some time to address some of these points. So first of all, I hope that today at least has helped some parts in understanding the requirements. So that should hopefully help one of those. Also, in terms of applying the requirements, I think the general approach that I would advise is find a system that can support a compliant process. So in other words, is it validated? Does it use device checks to ensure the validity of the data that comes into the system? Does it allow for you to make unique users that can sign off on each changes? Does it allow for you to extract audit logs? And does it allow for you to make different user access levels? Then pretty much the rest can be handled by processes. And I think that.
And maybe when I see this, I really think that that it's remarkable that it's so hard to find a compliant solution out there. It's something that we've seen before, but maybe share in the chat if you need any, I don't know, guide or what your concerns are, and then we can discuss it. Maybe we can do it here in the Q&A, or we might be able to help you with a guide, a general guide on something afterwards also. So feel free to do that. And Jakob, you must be thirsty for a glass of water. Let's just hone it in and see where we end up. So it's Q&A time.
Yeah.
Jakob, I do have a couple of questions from the chat, and let me just find a couple here too. Oopsie. There you go. All right. So we gonna do this. There you go. All right. We have had a couple of different questions, and that's also related to security. And one is like the expiry of passwords.
Yeah. So
what is that handled in FDA Part 11
yes.
domain, or is it somewhere else?
So it is required from in Part 11 to have rotating passwords, and it is required to have, I think the wording is strong or something, passwords. So yes, it is required to rotate passwords, and I think that's also a really good example of a place where you could either have a system that enforces password renewal, or you can implement that in a process. So that's really also one of the places where you can either be forced to operate it compliantly, or you can operate it compliantly. I think that the general consensus is that you would need to rotate your password every 6 months, but also really based on I would often say a risk-based approach, like trying to find out what is the criticality of access to the system, and how do you enforce it? Because in my perspective, at least, it's never going to be a successful implementation if you enforce something that's just not going to be possible. Yeah.
Another question we've got out there, which is interesting, I think, for technical-minded question, is the use of blockchain. Because blockchain might on the surface sound like it's super secure, and it's a technology that can use to make sure that you have these audit trails. But is it really that makes it live up to Part 11, or how do you look at that?
I mean, from my limited knowledge on blockchain, I must admit, and cryptocurrency, blockchain could certainly have an impact on the validity of the data you have in a system. Because you're able to cryptographically ensure the validity of the data in the system. I don't see the validity of the data in a system, or often the monitoring systems with our customers being the main concern, because often you will have those backed up by calibrations and validated systems, for sure. But I don't see, other than the validity and of data, that it be having a huge impact. But often I hope that I'm wrong, that that development supersedes me. But surely blockchain would have, I think, a place in terms of 21 CFR Part 11. I think 21 CFR Part 11, although it has requirements on validity of data, authenticity of data, in my perspective, that's not its main concern. It's our main priority from the FDA. In my objective, the main priority with Part 11 is to ensure that you have a link between a real person and a digital signature in the end in a system. That you can link between those, and they've implemented, well, in most other regards, if you look at implementation guidelines like GAM5, it's actually a very simple implementation guideline in Part 11. They've made some very specific recommendation, or not recommendation, but requirements on how should you implement that traceability through the use of passwords, and there's some expiry requirements for login sessions and the use of biometric scanners and so forth. But I think the main concern is basically how you link a person and a signature, and a device and some digital records in a system, rather than having to do with sort of the validity of that specific data.
And then we move, maybe that's moving on again to this space between analog and digital, because I assume that's something almost all of you out there you have troubles with, because we just have manual procedures here and there. And a very common question might be, okay, you have a print report without a signature. Can you make this printed report without that signature compliant towards FDA Part 11? Because
well, I mean, Part 11 only concerns digital records. So in that sense, you can print away and sign away by hand. According to Part 11 specifically, you can do all you want. Okay. One of the things that is specifically mentioned in Part 11 is it's not required if you have handwritten signatures that are then digitized. But if you want to do the signing in digital format, it should adhere to the Part 11. So if you have a report or any sort of input by hand and you sign it by hand, and then you scan it in, it's not really required to adhere to the Part 11.
And what about, you have an action that is a digital action that should be signed somehow, and then you have a analog action that then should be signed, and it's all part of the same chain of processes. So Part 11 is also very concise in terms of mixing formats, and that's perfectly fine as well. There are also some specific definitions in a sub-requirement report that states about specific data formats that have to be submitted to the FDA in electronic format, which then require you to follow Part 11. Batch records is an example of that. It has to be signed electronically. But other than that, there are not really that many, or there are not any requirements to perform or perform signatures digitally rather than by in hand. I always thought that it would be funny having this discussion in 10 years, because I find it hard to believe that anyone would do anything in paper format and pen and paper in 10 years. I simply think that we would not accept it anymore, or maybe in 10, 20, I don't know. I have high hopes for the future, but I mean, again, remember that Part 11, in my perspective, Part 11's requirements from a standpoint of wanting to digitalize handwritten signatures, I think is coming to an end. Maybe not in the near future, I hope so, but at least getting sort of its own standpoint in terms of saying digital signatures are the golden standard now. How do we ensure the validity of those? But today you can come from the standpoint of how do we digitalize handwritten signatures in some sense. We got a product-specific question here, like related to backing up. So we can talk about like normal backing up stuff, and we can talk about how we do it in UPRI.
Yeah.
What would be the normal like Part 11 compliant way of like you have all these papers and then you back it up in an archive like normal?
So Part 11 does not specifically mention backups, but it does mention retention periods. So again, going back all the way to the very high level, it's basically arrives from if you have a piece of documentation that originates from a predicate rule or is a sub-process to a predicate rule process, you need to adhere by that retention period. So you need to maintain a piece of documentation for 10 years. The digital format should, of course, maintain that for 10 years as well. In general, though, I think backup is of great importance because it's, in my mind, it's a support process for availability and validity of documentation. So in that sense, I think backup should be taken very seriously. And in my mind as well, we also see a lot of customers moving away from on-premise solutions to cloud solutions, which in my mind at least gives a much better possibility of backups.
Got it. And Jacob, how is that then done in UPRI?
So I mean, when I say we see people moving to cloud, it's also we are using cloud. So our process has been to use a very large cloud provider because it allows us for several availability zones, which means our data is backed up at several different geographical locations. And that's also something we see a lot of our customers starting to realize that might be a more reliable solution rather than having
because this customer this attendee writes that do I need to have a hard drive next to my computer and all that?
So I think having a hard drive next to your computer being the only place of backup is error-prone. It might be compliant. I'm not entirely sure, but it's greatly unadvisable. Having your backup next to where you have your records would be a very bad idea. In the same sense, again, I think if we think today even, the idea of having a very large paper-based backup system is sort of fading away. I don't think we'll see that in if we had the same discussion in 10 years. But then again, this is one of the areas where 21 CFR Part 11 kind of takes some of the requirements from other requirements that require you to have availability of data and validity of data, absolutely.
This is a good question. Like, how do you actually decide which actions are supposed to be tracked along the audit trail?
That's a very good question.
How do we do it?
So how do we do it? In a temperature monitoring setting, I would say again the examples that I've given are like again any action that you would need to sign or otherwise use to make a DXP based decision. So let's try to take that definition and apply it to different situations. So let's say you're going in and viewing the data for the last week. If that's all you're doing, would you sign that normally? No, you're just interested. You're doing your job. That would not have to be. Are you going in there reviewing the last 2 weeks because you're doing tendency analysis and you would normally sign that off somewhere? Then yes, then it has to be 21 CFR Part 11 compliant because you're doing a handwritten signature with a specific meaning. So let's say you wanted to be able to document that you reviewed the last 2 weeks data and you want to be able to document that somewhere. That would have to be Part 11 compliant. Another example could be you're changing the alarm settings. The alarm settings is something that you've probably gotten from a temperature mapping study, and you've applied those based on a risk-based approach, and you've done maybe some calculations to define your temperature limits based on calibration uncertainty. And we could talk hours about this, I know, Adam, but that's a DXP decision. So you would need to sign that of course, I would say of course, but you need to sign that. Let's say you do deviation management. Will you use your deviations to make GXP-based decisions? Well, yes, of course, because you will go back, look at all your deviations when you're doing your review processes, and you will say, well, do we have cause for concern? So yes, that would have to be signed. Absolutely.
So when talking about how did you decide on, because you were a big part of designing this module in UPRI, how did you decide on the actions that is predefinedly stored in this system?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Again, we asked ourselves, in a normal use setting, which kind of records would you need to show auditors? So I think that was our main point of thought, was what would you need to show auditors, or what could you reasonably be expected to submit to the FDA or any sort of other regulatory body. And those actions needs to be kept in the system. Going back to as well, inviting users to the system. When you've performed your validity check of the users in the system and you've chosen to invite that user, is that something you would normally sign up? Yeah, of course it is. So you need to sign up for that as well.
So it's users, it's deviation management, it's alarm settings.
Alarm settings. It could be general changes to the system, turning off alarms, turning on alarms.
What about the logbook? Because that's
logbooks, yeah. So that's kind of a gray zone again.
Okay.
If you are to do something that you would later on rely on to make a GXP-based decision, so let's say you have a procedure for cleaning. You need to clean your, let's say it's a fridge, you need to clean your fridge, and you would at some point go back and review, has this been performed weekly? Well, then you could use the logbook to note down cleaning, and then signing off on that action immediately. Yeah, then of course it would need to be Part 11 compliant.
And then a last one, like it's a typical question we get. So it's not possible to delete data in UPRI, but you can make it unclear to users.
Yeah, okay, so that's another really good. So that's one thing where Part 11, or at least Part 11 compliant systems are really helpful, because it helps us maintain the Alcoa principles, right? So of course, we would never advise not adhering to the Alcoa principles. But one thing, of course, is that when using a digital system that's compliant to Part 11, it's not really possible to backdate stuff. It's not possible to change original records. And that, of course, in all seriousness, is something that we surely hope everyone, I mean, in paper format as well, would adhere to. But in a 21 CFR Part 11 compliant system, you are forced to adhere by the core principles. Records are only recorded at the time of entry. Your signature is always assigned to the action. You can never delete any previous entries. You're always, one of the requirements is that any alteration to a record should never obscure the previous record, and all records should be in human readable format and so forth. So that enforces the Alcoa, and now it's the Alcoa Plus principles, of course. Yeah.
Right, Jakob, we're at the end of the webinar.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you all out there for listening. It's been really interesting to dive into this topic. It's as you can hear, we do monitoring, calibration, validation, and Part 11 has then been one of those compliance areas among a lot of compliance areas that we have had the luxury of diving into. And it seems to me that we've had like so many really interesting questions in the chat. Thank you very much for that. Thank you to Anja and Frederikke to help man the chat and answer them before Jakob and I could dive into it. I expect actually that we can follow up on this topic afterwards. So if we see something in the chat that seems to be relevant for most of you, we'll remember to share it with you. And don't hesitate at all to reach out to us if you want to dive more into it. We love geeking out in these areas. If you have comments, please share. You'd be welcome to that. And then in the end, thanks to Jan for hosting the event and helping us arrange it. I really hope you had a fun time out there. So thank you a lot.
Yeah.
See you around.
Thank you, everybody. Good. Have a good day. And fill out, please, the experience survey.
Nice. Bye bye.